Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. My name is Dean Detlaff, and I'm your co-host for the week.
And I'm the other co-host, Matt Bernico. Hello.
Yep, it's another week, another podcast, and there's a lot going on in the news. Lots of things we could talk about and won't talk about, I guess, this time around. The Pope came to Canada. We're not doing an episode on that right now. Maybe later. Maybe the lock-in. I don't know. Just gotta let that settle for a minute. I think.
Gotta let stew. Yeah. Can't talk about it too soon. Gotta wait for it to be just the right time. But what we can talk about is what's been going on in the online Christian discourse. That's what we love to do. I love doing it, at least. People will all talk about one thing for a long time on Twitter, and I don't ever know why. But today we're going to get to the bottom of it. So the online discourse on Christian Twitter has been really concerned with the phrase Christian nationalism. We've talked about this a handful of times in the past. You can go back through our extensive catalog of episodes, and I'm sure listen to us talk about nationalism or whatever a lot. But we're going to do it again, this time with a little bit of a different twist. So the particular discourse going on right now, it got going, it got bubbling when Marjorie Taylor Greene, a representative from Georgia, decided that it was cool for her to just call herself a Christian nationalist at a Turning Point USA event. Here, I'll read the quote for you if you aren't familiar. She says she's a Christian nationalist, and that's not a bad word. It's actually a good thing. There's nothing wrong with leading with your faith. If we do not live our lives and vote like we are nationalists, caring about our country and putting our country first and wanting that to be the focus of our federal government, if we don't lead that way, then we'll not be able to fix it. A real jumble of words. I love it. A big, delicious word salad on this hot summer's day. Anyway, so she said that she's a Christian nationalist, and everyone let out a collective groan because that means we have to talk about it nonstop until we figure it out. So out of this, a lot of big questions, I think, have been bubbling up to the surface once again on twitter.com. And I'm sure on Facebook and other places too, maybe even in your personal life, who knows? But, you hear people talking about big questions like, is Christian nationalism even the right word, right? Is there a different word we can throw in there? You could. We'll talk about that later. Is patriotism and nationalism the same thing, or are they different? Who cares? And then is the U.S. a Christian nation? That's the big one, right? If it is, then maybe we should be Christian nationalists or something. So in this episode, we've decided to chime in and answer all these hot questions that people on the internet can't stop talking about. A lot of liberals have been really invested in answering these questions in very historical ways, especially the one about the U.S. being a Christian nation. And that's interesting and fine. Go for it, guys. I don't care. But we're gonna diverge a little bit from the liberal answers here. And right at the beginning, we're gonna drop the hottest and spiciest take yet. And we're going to say, oh, not we. Well, I mean, I guess I'm speaking royally for Dean as well. So, Dean, if you want to stop me, I guess you can. But we're going to say, yep, the U.S. is a Christian nation, but for all the worse. not in a good way. Not in the Marjorie Taylor Greene way, but also not in the way that anyone else wants it to be. So we'll get into why and how in just a minute. But first, let's do the thing we also love to do on this podcast and talk about philosophy. Too much.
Yep, we're going to do it. We're going to talk about philosophy, but this time, okay, eventually we are going to talk about a French guy, but not right away. First, we're going to talk about an Austrian guy.
Austrian it's pretty close.
Or English
if you
guy.
Think about it.
Pretty close. France is kind of on the way between those two countries. You guessed it, Ludwig Wittgenstein. He is a wild guy, and we're not going to say too much about him, but the big question, I think, for me, when anybody starts talking about words and what they mean is, what are words at all? What do we mean when we talk about what things mean? And it is a difficult thing to figure out. It kind of consumed all the brightest philosophical minds of the 20th century and still today. And when people start sort of thinking about terms and really nailing them down and being like, well, here's Christian nationalism, exactly what it means, or here's Christianity and here's nationalism and here's how they do or don't go together, I always find myself thinking about people like Wittgenstein, and we'll talk about some others too. But Wittgenstein had this really interesting kind of way of talking about language where he said, if you're trying to find the one single kind of ultimate universal definition of a term or a phrase, you're doing something extremely weird. That was his way of thinking it through. Or like sometimes he would say, you have like philosophy disease. It's a big problem. You what you do is you take what is kind of normal in everyday life, right? We all use terms, we all use language, and they're just part of the flow of conversation. And then you take them out of that flow and you start sort of like putting them under the microscope and treating them as though they're not like part of that conversation, but they're something else, right? They're like magic kind of things that have this definite meaning behind them. And so the philosopher is always looking for like what exactly are these words and what exactly do they mean. And Wittgenstein said, if you want to know what a word means, you should look at how it's used in particular. And I think that kind of gets us started in a way more interesting conversation about something like Christian nationalism. It's a weird phrase because it gets used in lots of different ways, right? And that is what Wittgenstein actually was interested in kind of explaining, that words probably don't have just one meaning. They actually float around and they get all kinds of other meanings depending on how they get used. He had this metaphor of saying language is kind of like playing a game. So there's all these rules that you learn about how to sort of use words within that game. But the game is flexible, and we're all kind of playing all the time, and it's all a bit of a mess. So the key is to try to learn the rules, but also understand that they're in flux, and we're all sort of playing together. And at least that, I think, starts shifting our brains a little bit for thinking about Christian nationalism. So the idea isn't to say, well, Christianity is one thing, nationalism is another thing, and they never go together, or that they always have to be apart by definition, right? Or to say Christian nationalism is a contradiction in terms, something that never makes sense, or is an oxymoron, or whatever it might be. It's easier to, I think, or more helpful. It gets us on a different path to start asking, well, how are these terms used, and what do they mean when people use them?
That's right. That's exactly what we should be asking. I mean, it seems like I don't know, the very weird philosophy disease that you mentioned at the very beginning of this description is exactly the weird pitfall that people keep falling into around Christian nationalism and Christianity in general. That like Christianity has some kind of universal meaning that like if you say it, if you say it enough times in a think piece on some website, people will just know what you're talking about. And if you're trying to differentiate, Christian nationalism from it, you can do it easily and disentangle these things, but it's actually quite hard for all the reasons you said.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, now is the time for the French guide.
Oui, oui.
Wittgenstein gets you pretty far, I think. Asking some good questions about language, he can kind of maybe change the terms of it a little bit. But even more helpful or important and kind of along these lines is the approach of somebody, Michel Foucault, a really weird French philosopher. I don't know, he probably wouldn't say he's a philosopher, but I'm going to say that he is.
Well, that's where you'd read him, right? You'd read him in a philosophy class.
Yeah, or I think people read him in a lot of disciplines now. He shows up everywhere, but whatever, he's dead, so he can't say that I can't call him a philosopher. Foucault had this kind of way of thinking about language that was a bit similar to Wittgenstein. Like he also said, if you really want to know about words and what they mean, you should look at how they're used. But where Foucault added something different was he said, and when you look at how they're used, what you find is they're always used, words are always used, or language is always used in a kind of network of power relationships. So if you want to know what a term like Christian nationalism means, or, other things, whatever, democracy, politics, and so on, you should look at this kind of big constellation of institutions and speakers and books and whatever that all kind of contribute to the meaning of that phrase or word, and vice versa. So the way that word gets used or phrase gets used contributes to a new constellation of power relationships. And for Foucault, the really interesting question isn't necessarily what's the final meaning of this term, but it lets you ask other kinds of questions. For example, what does saying a sentence like the United States is a Christian nation, what does that make possible for people to do? Or what kinds of like worlds are produced by saying that statement? What arrangements of power are brought into the world with a statement like that? And it lets you ask some other questions like, how does the position of the person actually saying that statement, how does that sort of change what the statement means? So, for example, if you're on the left, and like Matt said at the top of this episode, you said the U.S. is a Christian nation, and so much the worse for us, what does that do to that kind of phrase? Or, what does it make possible or impossible to say that Christianity and nationalism are mutually exclusive terms, right? All these different kinds of conversations or maybe proposals that you see in the discourse today around Christian nationalism. And I think that is at least where I start going when I hear these kinds of terms. Like, what does it mean for us to, what does it mean for Marjorie Taylor Greene to say the US is a Christian nation? And what does it mean for a liberal or progressive Christian to say, no, it isn't, or this doesn't make sense to say that, or whatever? And I think when we start asking that question, we actually get to a level of conversation that's underneath just the kind of partisan one. And we can really figure out, like, well, what's at stake here, right? What is saying these kind of statements do for the way that we think and act politically?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, you can see how the rest of the discourse kind of, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she says that she's a Christian nationalist. The United States is a Christian nation. Shouldn't we be Christian nationalists and wanting the best for those kinds of things or whatever, right? But then you can see how when she says that phrase, when she makes that claim from her particular position of power, with her particular background and all these other intentions that go along with it, right? Then you see how the entire discourse kind of gets strung along right behind it. and now everyone else has to use that particular meaning of Christian nation, right? And it makes things like it can definitely muddy the waters though of meaning and of intention. Like I guess like when it comes to Foucault, the what always comes to mind for me is, I mean, definitely this idea about discourse and power and stuff. But in the he has a book called The Archaeology of Knowledge, which is great, good book, I guess. It's complicated, but in it he's talking about what is like a history of ideas, right, and how you would trace a history of an idea. And like this is me kind of thinking about it on the fly, so maybe it's not exactly right, but I think I'm pretty close here at least. But that there's like there are beginnings and there are ends to ideas and words and phrases and stuff like that, right? But like it's difficult because they're not all the same. It's like a big tree with very mixed up roots, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That sometimes like a word will stop and it will take on a new meaning, it'll get reconstituted, it'll get like flipped around. But like, I guess right now you can kind of see the ways that Christian nationalism or the U.S. as a Christian nation kind of getting caught up in a particular sort of network of right wing political projects, and that's the important part. And then when liberals respond on the other direction, right, it kind of like activates a handful of other ideas that strings it along in a different direction. All that to say that like the ways that people use Christian nationalism, or the phrase like we've been repeating over and over that the United States is a Christian nation, the way people use it, it serves a particular political end, and it kind of forecloses certain political possibilities and prohibits others, right? Like a Christian nation, in this sense, in either the liberal or the conservative way of thinking, right? It refers to like a particular capitalist, either reactionary or liberal democracy. But but it's not meaning the project of Christians fighting against the Philippines, the government in the Philippines or something. Like it's not activating those same types of things, because it's in like sort of different rhetorical networks, and those things are quite important for kind of figuring out what these things might mean.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, on another episode we did a long time about nationalism, a long time ago about nationalism, we talked about the meaning of patriotism, right? Where like if you're in the U.S. and you're on the left, patriotism is usually a dirty word, or you're understandably allergic to it, unless you're like one of those weird patriotic socialist people. Not for me. But patriotism is bound up in these very toxic ways that people think about imperialism and national identity and so on. But in a country like, well, in a revolutionary situation, like in revolutionary Nicaragua or in Cuba, or in, I don't know, certain sectors of China historically, right? The term nation in Christian contexts has been very different, because the way that the nation is understood or operative and so on, and the way that patriotism is understood and operative is a different kind of situation. So, yeah, the question is sort of not finding the ultimate definition of a term, but rather seeing terms and phrases in kind of ecosystems of power. So I think when we talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene saying the United States is a Christian nation, it's probably obvious what's going on, I would think, right? She she wants to preserve a kind of Christian hegemony. This is a long-standing project on the right in the United States, and she's tapping into that long-standing project. Like, it's not novel that she is taking that on board. I mean, she's saying that she's a Christian nationalist, partly probably in response to people saying Christian nationalism is
Mhm.
bad. And so she's owning that, I guess, rhetorically, which is a probably smart rhetorical move. And she's doing that in order to double down on all kinds of things, right? White supremacy, a certain kind of Christianity that to her is acceptable. You know, she famously does not like Catholics, or at least Catholics that aren't extremely reactionary, that sort of thing. So, you know, what it means for her to say the U.S. is a Christian nation is obviously bad and yucky, but you can understand it in that history, in that kind of complex history. I think for me though, what the kind of liberal response to it by kind of automatically pushing that aside, or pushing that statement aside that the United States is a Christian nation, what the liberal response fails to do or kind of lacks is ask that second Foucauldian question, which is like, well, are there other kind of matrices of power, other networks of terms where actually saying a term like that makes different kind of lines of thinking possible? So the liberal approach shuts down some of those lines of thinking. And maybe we could talk about that in a minute, but that's in broad strokes what I'm getting at. Just trying to think through what does it mean to recontextualize
Yeah,
that statement.
definitely. A lot of things to talk about in a little bit, as always. I think something that like really rubs me the wrong way about this conversation is that having been sort of an evangelical transitioning away from evangelicalism in the early 2000s, I feel like there's like a certain like soft spot this like hits for me, or maybe not soft spot, but like tender spot, like when your tooth has a
Mm-hmm.
big hole in it and you eat something that you shouldn't, and it and it hurts your teeth. That's how this feels. I guess I say that because the Christianity in that particular time, right, the early 2000s, it's kind of like trying to figure out what to do with like the Bush years, or trying to figure out like what any of that meant, or respond to the Christian nationalism of the Bush years in a faithful way, right? So you get all kinds of different people like John Howard Yoder or Shane Claiborne, who we love to talk about on this podcast in various ways, and Stanley Hauerwas and so on. Right, all these people kind of responding to the horrors of the Bush years, um, and I guess it's just frustrating to me because it's like right now the conversation from liberals seems to be like Christian nationalism is like this new phenomena that we have to raise a lot of red flags about in the moment because it's like it's this imposter Christianity that's arrived on the scene and now it's a problem. But it's like it's been a problem for a pretty long time, and it's really
Mm-hmm.
frustrating. I guess to see it like that. So, for example, there's an article from CNN that's an opinion piece, and it's called Marjorie Taylor Greene's "Words on Christian Nationalism Are a Wake Up Call" by Amanda Tyler. Which whatever. I mean, it should be a wake up call. People should be mad about it. But something that she said in the piece like really irked me. She says that Christian nationalism, while pervasive and long-standing, cannot be normalized. I think Christians who continue to make up a majority of Americans, I'm not sure if that's really true, have special responsibility to step up to this critical moment and reject Christian nationalism. And like, fair enough, Christians should definitely wake up and reject Christian nationalism. But like to say that it can't be normalized is really frustrating because it's definitely normalized. I don't know. It just seems like such a bizarre way to think about it. That okay, the Bush years is also are the Bush years are also not the beginning of Christian nationalism either. They're just sort of my they're my wake up call because that's when I was a teen. But I guess it's frustrating because it's like these things are very normal. What's not normal are people kind of going ahead and just saying that they're Christian nationalists or that they don't believe in the separation of church and state, like Lauren Boebert or whatever. So it's frustrating all around because this is a problem that has existed for a long time, and to be raising your alarms or getting your hackles up about it now is kind of like where you been.
Yeah. And I mean, not only Bush too, but it's a bipartisan problem, right? I mean, Democrats are Christian nationalists in a
Yeah.
different kind of way. I mean, they have maybe a more pluralistic view of what their Christianity calls them to in nation building, and they have a concern about the separation of church and state that's a bit more defined and so on. And good for them, genuinely. That's a better alternative for sure. But at the same time, like, I don't know, every single president that has ever been the president of the United States is a Christian, and all of them have been nationalists. So it's true that it takes on different qualities. It's not Christian nationalism in the same way. I mean, they're not out there being like, we need to really, synonymize Christian values with national values or something like that. But there is a kind of underlying, I guess, attempt to find a homology between, like, the faith, like, whatever. Barack Obama often talked about his own Christian faith and how it leads to his civic values, or, you get the same thing in Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter, everybody's favorite Baptist or whatever. Like, these are, there's a longstanding problem, I guess, in thinking through just the nuances and complexities of Christian nationalism that also gets maybe a little bit, like, saying that Christian nationalism is just a right-wing phenomenon actually stops you from asking those other kinds of questions. Like, what if this is a bigger problem? A problem that's bigger than just, like, Marjorie Taylor Greene speaking at a conference.
Totally. And if it's not, like, okay, like you just said a minute ago, right? All of the presidents are Christians and they've all been nationalists, and that's totally true. But also, like, that infrastructure within evangelical churches has existed for an extremely long time as well. It's not a new problem. I mean, I think I don't know. Here, like, most evangelical churches have something called Freedom Sunday where they celebrate the troops, and it's like, if you want to see Christian nationalism, go to, like, literally any, even, like, mainline Protestant denomination during that Sunday, and you can kind of see it all happening right before your eyes. And exactly, on the 4th of July, or maybe, like, right after it, or whatever. It doesn't matter. But, like, I don't know. It's all there. It's all there, and it's all already there. And it's, I'm not saying it's not worse when somebody says it out loud or something, but, like, it's somebody saying the quiet part loud, and maybe that's what people are frustrated about, which is fair, but still kind of dumb.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so maybe we could pivot a little bit to asking that question of what would it mean to say that the U.S. is a Christian nation in a complicated way. Because I think, like, this is I guess, our Zizek moment on the podcast to be like, aha, but what if Marjorie Taylor Greene is right?
Yeah, finally, the perverse core of the Magnificast, we got there.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, there was an essay by Diana Butler Bass recently kind of talking about all this stuff, and she said what kept coming to her mind is that the United States is not a Christian nation, but it has been influenced by Protestantism in a meaningful way over time. And in the essay, she tried to kind of also say that, like, if it was a Christian nation, it would be promoting all these different values that were, And then she also looked at a handful of what she called attempts to build a Christian nation that didn't work out, kind of utopian communities, or, like, I don't know, Mormonism, so on and so forth. And, she basically is trying to make the case that talking about the U.S. as a Christian nation is sort of ahistorical or not quite right, but it relies on this theological premise that basically Christianity has to be good. It has to be good, and it has to believe in the good things. And if a nation doesn't do those good things, then it doesn't earn the title of Christian. And by proxy, those people who've tried to do it didn't pan out. So it's a losing strategy. And I can kind of understand what she's saying, but like we talk about on the show all the time, Christianity is not our best hopes for it, right? It is a big constellation or collection or archive of all kinds of stuff from all over the world, from lots of historical points in time, and some of them are great, and some of them are truly awful. And when we think about Christianity, it's important to not avoid, or how do I say it positively? It's important to affirm that all that goes into the big stew that is Christianity, unfortunately. And we have to kind of take that on board. So to say the United States is a Christian nation is to recognize that a country that has only ever had Christian presidents is probably, like, rightly considered a Christian nation. Diana Butler Bass does go out of her way to say, like, she doesn't like the idea that, if a country has a state church or is significantly influenced by Christianity, it's not necessarily a Christian nation, even if we kind of talk about that geopolitically. But I don't find it very convincing to kind of wash our hands of it. It seems to me you actually can get a lot further thinking through the problems of the United States politically and historically if you affirm that a lot of those problems originate in extremely Christian ideas, identifiable Christian ideas, including Christian ideas about the separation of
Hmm.
church and state, right? They might be good or bad ideas or whatever, but Christianity is the soil out of which the United States grows, and we've never had a leader at the executive level who is not a Christian. And that is helpful to kind of see because it opens up other lines of inquiry or makes other questions possible. Like, okay, the US is a Christian nation, and if you happen to be a non Christian nation, that is often bad
Hmm.
news for you. Even in terms of global imperialism, George Bush explicitly said that he was spreading Christian democracy in the Middle East. That did not go very well. It's important to sort of say there is a Christian project going on, and that happens both with Republicans and Democrats at the helm. Especially during the Cold War, I guess, but even today, and it's good to maybe kind of sit with the uncomfortability of that rather than try to push it aside under the kind of the theological hope that Christianity is pure or kind of immune to that
Right. I mean,
criticism.
I totally get the impulse to want to say it's not, that it's not deserving of the title of Christianity. I think that I understand that impulse. I get it, and I want to do
Of
that too.
course.
But I think it doesn't really make sense sociologically or like in the Foucauldian sense for sure. It doesn't make sense if you think of religion, though. I think in terms of like, I don't know, the way that we are talking about it last week, right? A thing that you plug lots of different things into. For example, the United States is fundamentally an inheritor of the doctrine of discovery in a whole lot of ways, right? Like manifest destiny is the materialization of that belief in within the confines of United States history. And without being a quote unquote Christian nation, like I don't know, could that have happened? Yeah, I guess, but like there's a real Christian flavor to it. I mean the genocide of indigenous people is a Christian thing to happen. And on and on and on, right? And to say that like, well, it's not deserving of this term is just kind of like missing the point that Christianity is not always good. Christianity is, I think what it produces. I think maybe is the way I like to think about it at
Mm-hmm.
least. And if you do think about it that way, you see that the inheritance that we have of Christianity is bad. Right, and maybe if we start thinking about different ways to process that past and ways that we could pivot in the future, like maybe that would be a better way to move forward. She Diana Butler Bass at the very end of the Substack that she wrote about Christian nationalism, she does have a good paraphrase of the Apostle Paul, which I appreciate. That she says that we do the very thing that we hate, even while pressing toward the
Mm-hmm.
good, and I think that's still a pretty good word. I mean, that's exactly what Christians do. We do the thing that we're not trying to do all the time, but fundamentally, there's still some type of like eschatological hope or like idea of what the world could be if we were just like a little bit better people. And I don't know. I find that pretty convincing. Just the same too, right? Christianity is definitely responsible for all the bad, but it also gives us an imagination if we kind of read it in a different light to think of what could be better. And I think that's fine. But it is complicated, right? This is why the Foucauldian thing is important because there are all these different meanings being activated at once. Some not for other people, but but I think that part of the a strategy I think for people who still find Christianity to be like a meaningful religious movement is to find ways to activate a bigger network to recognize that like what's happening with Christian nationalism is definitely our inheritance that we have to kind of come to deal with, but also growing our our brains about what we think is possible with Christianity. So to know that like there's a different idea of Christianity, and there's a different idea of the church, there's a different idea of religion out there that we could use to leverage something better.
Yeah, no, I agree for sure. I think my big question is, I guess, still a Foucauldian question, which is what power relations are served by denying that the U.S. is a Christian nation, or even
Yeah.
like one phrase you just said, Matt, a minute ago, which this isn't what you meant, but this is what kind of came to mind. You said uh, Christianity wasn't trying to do this or something like that. But of course, like
Oh,
some Christians were, which is,
absolutely.
like you
Yeah.
said, not what you were saying. But I was just keying in on that because I think that's a kind of turn of phrase that you often get in liberal Christianity, that like, oh, Christians, they weren't really following the gospel, or they weren't really like being Christians when they did this. But the troubling thing is, like, maybe they were though, like,
Yeah, totally.
like on purpose, they were spreading the faith in these really awful ways, or
I mean, when it comes to like chattel slavery in
yeah,
the United States, that's totally the case,
exactly.
right? Christians were doing that on
Yeah, and
purpose.
with Christian reasons to do it.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
the sad part about it. And so, yeah, like I said, the Foucauldian question is what power relationships are kind of sustained, and kind of made possible or fed by this move to make Christianity innocent all the time. And
Right.
I think it's like, it's a Christian hegemony basically that is sustained. And I mean, Diana Butler Bass, like, you could do a lot worse for sure. She's not a bad person, I guess. I don't think she seems fine.
I don't
Yeah, I
know.
don't know either. But like, I guess what I'm saying is, like, you'd rather have a progressive Christian around than a super conservative one. But if the history of the left teaches us anything, it's that progressives can also end up reinforcing all kinds of really subtle ways that oppressive powers kind of have their tentacles, around us. Especially when we think about what the damage that Christianity does in our societies, even progressive forms of Christianity. It makes a big difference that we understand that Christianity is complicit in the violence that happens in chattel slavery and the genocide of indigenous peoples, in global imperialism, all these kinds of systems. Because if we don't see that Christianity is part of that and really take the time to parse that out, then our own Christianity is probably going to smuggle all that stuff back in, because it's the unthought through trauma, the unworked through illness that's still down there, kind of causing all these symptoms. So it's not to say that when you affirm, oh yeah, the U.S. is a Christian nation and so much the worse for us. Not to say that if you say that, all of a sudden you're going to have it figured out. But like it put,
Because
yeah,
I don't.
exactly,
I just said it.
exactly. But like, it puts you on a path maybe to figuring it out in a way that saying, well, Christianity is always going to be innocent, actually stops you from going down that path entirely.
Not only is Christianity innocent, but then also it kind of creates a space for an innocent U.S.
Yeah,
hegemony.
yeah,
Like in some of the takes that I've been reading around this, people will be like, "Well, I'm a Christian and a patriot, but also like I'm not a Christian
right.
nationalist." And it's like, I don't know, that's pretty ugly too, I think, right? And so to keep Christian nationalism at an arm's length while saying you're a patriot and a Christian seems bad in the same way. Honestly, it was just like you're trying to create this like space where your form of Christianity and your idea of the United States is not bad. It's not the one that is planning coups in Latin America, but like we all know it
Hmm.
is. So I don't know. It's frustrating to see that. It does far more harm than I think they know they're doing. But whatever.
Yeah, the example that always comes to mind for me, and that I use a lot, that I've probably said on this podcast more than once, is Oscar Romero, the bishop in El Salvador. If you don't know about him, check him out for sure. He was, I don't know, interesting voice for the poor in the middle of a extremely conflicted situation. He wrote a letter to Jimmy Carter as the U.S. president, basically saying, we have this right-wing government in El Salvador, and it's causing a lot of violence and problems in my country, and you should, he was like appealing to him as a Christian, saying you should withdraw your support for this government. And so the letter is interesting because it's framed in terms of like, I'm a Christian, you're a Christian, don't you not want the poor to suffer, right? That's kind of the sort of driving pulse of it. And Romero was assassinated just a few months after that letter by an assassin who, kind of down the chain, was ultimately basically a U.S. trained kind of right wing force. There was these U.S. paramilitaries that were operative in El Salvador, and yeah, lots of complicated things there. But all that to say, it's a really troubling object lesson in exactly this, because the United States, as a Christian hegemony in the world, was also funding all these right wing people who were murdering Christians in El Salvador, including a guy who ended up becoming a saint. And Romero had tried to appeal to Jimmy Carter on the grounds of both of them being Christians, and for whatever reason, didn't get picked up. And I think
Right.
it's just important that we recognize that, Christianity is a faith tradition that is literally at war with itself all over the planet. And we have to be able to name that is an internal antagonism, an internal contradiction, or else we're never going to be able to deal with it. And that's exactly what the idea of the US being innocent or Christianity being innocent or US patriotism being innocent kind of leads us to. I mean, if you say that you're a US patriot, I think it basically suggests that you're ignorant of, what the United States does. And
Pretty
yeah.
sus. Pretty
And I
sus.
mean, a lot of people are, to be fair. Like, where would you go find out, I guess, other than if you happen to be in left spaces or you meet a handful of people or we all kind of grow up. Like, the education system is designed to shield you from that for sure. So, like, I have some sympathy, I guess, for people who are ignorant, but very little sympathy for people who who don't try not to be. So, it's just it's important to sort of figure out what our language is telling us about ourselves.
Yeah, I don't want to push the point too far because we don't have a lot of time left. But I'm going to anyways. I guess what I'm trying to say. You said that Christianity is at war with itself. I think it's a great line because it is in all kinds of very interesting ways. I mean, yeah, a lot of different examples that come to mind, but I guess the one that's always the most stark is the Korean War. Maybe this is because there's a new season of the Blowback podcast, which I like quite a bit, and it's about the Korean War. And it's very interesting. But anyways, evangelical Christians are always bemoaning the fact that they need to send missionaries to the DPRK. That's the place they need to go to because they're not going to hear the gospel there because there are no churches. Or I mean, the reality situation is that Christianity looks very different. But just the same, it's like why are there no churches there? And it's because during the Korean War, the United States bombed them all and destroyed them. So it's like I don't know. Christians did that bombing too. So it's like it is very much at war with itself because of U.S. imperialism. Those two things are, I guess it's important to kind of keep that Foucauldian vibe going though, right? Because you can see the ways that those networks are really intertwined with one another, discursively, but also in terms of like power.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Yikes.
I guess that's the thing though, is it's easy to point to Marjorie Taylor Greene and be like, look, when she says the US is a Christian nation, she is kind of intentionally building a discursive world, a network of power and language relationships on purpose, right? She's
Yeah.
trying to create a bit of a world in which people will be politically active in a right wing way, right? So everything is obvious; it's on the face of it, and that's what people are criticizing. They shouldn't be using Christianity to recruit people into right wing politics. And yes, true, of course. But the more troubling Foucauldian thing is like, well, the subtle ways in which we talk about this problem actually reveal to us how much we too are intertwined into dangerous Christian hegemonies that we don't understand. And I think that's anyway, that's the meat of the Foucault piece for me, at least.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's pivot a little bit more then. Okay, so Christian nationalism is a phrase that makes all kinds of things possible. And isn't that interesting? But it's also the case that liberals are very much caught up in Christian nationalism without wanting to admit it. They're involved in sort of a different way, right? But the idea that I think we need to kind of work through then is like, is Christian nationalism the word that if we use that word, does it activate some type of helpful analysis? Does it activate some type of like new point where we can kind of break from it? Or is there a different word that we can use? And I'm here to tell you with some good news. You probably saw the tweet already. It's on Twitter. But maybe instead of saying Christian nationalism, we should just be, I think, a little bit more upfront and say Christian fascism. Or maybe in the more like the postmodern sort of Foucauldian sense, we could ask the question: what does Christofascism make possible that Christian nationalism doesn't? And I think that is maybe the direction we should probably start thinking.
Yeah, right. Because just here's part of the pitch right off the bat. I'm going to try to sell you on why we should use Christofascism, not Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is a kind of phrase that is extremely easy to appropriate in the way that Marjorie Taylor Greene did, right? She is a Christian nationalist. Like, it's not an insult to her. And people want to use that term as though it's self-evidently bad. I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric you see a lot of the time in certain progressive Christian circles. Like, they'll accuse someone of being a Christian nationalist and kind of expect that everybody is on board with that. It's kind of the weird libidinal politics of like saying something that makes you satisfied with what you've said, but it doesn't actually accomplish anything. As opposed to Christofascism. I mean, maybe in theory, like there is a politician out there who's like, no, I'm happily a Christofascist, and I'd be happy for them to admit that. That would be genuinely useful to me. But like Marjorie Taylor Greene is not going to stand in front of Turning Points USA and be like, I'm a Christofascist. She might complain that people call her that, but it's not a term she's going to appropriate. And I think it's also, there's a kind of strategic reason to use it in that way. But it also is just more accurate. It's a better descriptor of what's problematic here and creates a little bit more space between like kinds of Christian nationalisms, perhaps. Because the Christian nationalism that whatever, like Pete Buttigieg is out there promoting in his own way is not the same as the Christian nationalism of Marjorie Taylor Greene or George W. Bush, which is probably also different from Marjorie Taylor Greene in some nuanced way, right? So Christofascism, at least, again, kind of just puts us on a path to have some more precise language. Just a better term that makes other kinds of analyses possible.
I think that's good. Yeah, and it's not able to be appropriated, and I like that about it. I mean, at least not yet. You never know in the future. It could always be, I guess. Well, if we're going to talk about Christofascism, as we are, we got to talk about Dorothy Zuela because she's the person who kind of coins this term, or at least is the most helpful explainer of it. So Dorothy Zuela has an essay called Christofascism where she kind of lays it all out. And I think that like her explanation, I think, still fits totally. Mostly her explanation is kind of reflecting on the spectacular aspects of like televangelism. But I think it translates pretty well, actually. It's not that much of a stretch. Dean, what do you want to say about it? Anything?
I mean, I'll read part of it, I guess.
Oh, sure.
Do that. I mean, the televangelism stuff is great, but as you say, it makes sense today. So she says, people are told repeatedly that pornography, homosexuality, and promiscuity go with secular humanism, Satanism, and communism, and these last three are lumped together without distinction. The primitiveness of the argumentation is scandalous. For believers who are dependent on authority and in search of something to hold on to, religion is instrumentalized in order to engender hate, to lead them into battle and crusades. It's this instrumentalization of religion for completely different ends that inspired me to formulate a concept that needs further clarification, Christofascism. And here's kind of how she explains it. This is a little bit of a long passage, but I think it's worth it just to get us chatting a bit.
Yeah.
So she says, in our public discussion, the concept of fascism has been almost completely reduced to totalitarianism, even by the moderate right. All the other essential elements of German fascism in particular, such as its racist mania and militarism, are dismissed as irrelevant. According to the strange logic of some of our guardians of democracy, President Reagan, because he was democratically elected, simply cannot have any fascist tendencies. In this debate, the electoral process as such takes on a sacrosanct quality, as if no democratic country had ever stumbled into genocide, in Southeast Asia, for example. Democracy, in this way of thinking, is a purely formal structure in its lack of political substance, so evident in its militarism, racism, sexism, and neocolonial exploitation of the peoples of the Third World, is of no further interest. But the most dangerous thing about Christofascist religion is precisely that it is not compulsory, nor is it brought about in totalitarian fashion by violence. It's a matter of what critical Americans call soft fascism. Chauvinistic nationalism, militarization of one's own land and all dependent countries, lots of other kind of qualities that she puts together here. But she says, one sort of essential difference between this and European fascism is, in my judgment, the geopolitical fact that nowadays the concentration camps are not close to Weimar or Munich, but far away. In El Salvador, the Philippines, South Africa, etc. And the last thing here, she says, at a mass meeting, 1,000 voices shouted, I love Jesus and I love America. It was impossible to distinguish the two. This kind of religion knows the cross only as a magical symbol of what he has done for us, not as the sign of a poor man who is tortured to death as a political criminal, like thousands who stand up for truth in El Salvador. This is a God without justice, a Jesus without a cross, an Easter without a cross. What remains is a metaphysical Easter bunny in front of the beautiful blue light of the television screen, a betrayal of the disappointed, a miracle weapon in service of the mighty. So lots of good rhetoric at the end, but I guess just to kind of center on what she finds really useful is, first of all, fascism as a definition is so kind of restricted to some incredibly basic points about Nazi Germany that we don't use it anywhere else. And then secondly, for her, U.S. fascism is characterized by this massive expansionist kind of state that is then held together by this sort of theological, very abstract faith that prevents you from, I guess, ever seeing where that empire really lands.
This is why the Christian nationalism thing is so frustrating, is because it is hard. It's like because there's such a distance between, I think, the way that Christian nationalism sounds to people and the way that it sounds like in relations to fascism, right? Like the two ideas just don't necessarily go together for people in their brains, but which is frustrating, which is why we need to maybe do this podcast. But something that kind of rings more true to fascism, though, is actually what this is from Lauren Boebert. She's a representative as well, and definitely in the same the same vein as Marjorie Taylor Greene. But she really recently she had this kind of I don't know, this really pithy statement that, anyways, she just said that there shouldn't really be any separation between the church and state. We got to get rid of all that junk. It's not in the Constitution. Blah blah blah. Some really stupid stuff, right? So I mean, I guess that's historically wrong, probably in some ways. Thinking about the Constitution, but who cares? She doesn't care for sure, right? But anyways, that I think is a great example of how Christian fascism looks and feels, because I think it's maybe closer to what you'd expect from fascism. So it's maybe easier to call that a type of Christian fascism, but I think it's it's still it's not a far cry from what Marjorie Taylor Greene's after, anyways. So it seems like this is rhetoric that works, but I think the Christofascism part and kind of explain the way that it's not compulsory, that it kind of is a type of soft fascism that people pick up on purpose and voluntarily, not at a ballot box or at some kind of I don't know, riot or whatever, is a really helpful explanation. Though, I mean, people are also using the phrase Christian nationalism around the January 6th riots at the Capitol and stuff, which is right. I mean, when you're reading the Christ without a cross, without resurrection, stuff like that, I guess it makes me feel, it makes me think of a lot of those scenes too, from when people were putting up crosses outside the outside the Capitol. A little on the nose, if you ask me, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the other thing that she brings out so well is that Christofascism is precisely voluntary, right? That's what makes it so troubling. It's not that Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert or whatever are out there conscripting people into whatever the Hitler Youth is of of us, the United States or something. I mean, surely some of that does happen in youth groups in the world. All you have to do is watch Jesus Camp or something to kind of get a sense of how it happened in the Bush years.
Right.
So, I mean, there are cases where it's not so voluntary and it does resemble more straightforwardly maybe that other kind of fascism that we have in our brains. But it's more subtle and more challenging to parse out, to kind of see the ways in which people do get recruited into Christofascism. Before Matt and I started recording, I was just reading the Wikipedia of Marjorie Taylor Greene, trying to be where'd this lady even come from? And, I think I've read a few explainers or biographies of her kind of in articles here and there, but for some reason just now, it clicked for me that she was a huge CrossFit person in 2012 and then leading up to her political career. Which, I mean, not that every, middle-aged woman who's a CrossFit person ends up being a Christofascist, for sure. But, there's a trend. It's out there. There's a type. And I think it's just, important to be I don't know, how does a CrossFit lady turn into a person talking at like a Christo-fascist in front of like a handful of Republican teens at Turning Points USA, you know? And I think those are the kinds of questions that like kind of just get elided a little bit by the mainstream discourse around Christian nationalism. You know, we're dealing with something that's actually like way more problematic than that. Like something that is way more ingrained into our daily lives than Christian nationalism, or the way that it gets talked about, at least in kind of liberal circles. And unless we're willing to even parse out what Christofascism is, it's going to be really, really difficult to get rid of it. And certainly we're not going to get rid of it by like being like, well, I'm a Christian patriot and I reject it and I've done it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's true. It's frustrating too because, like, of course, like only the people in the mainstream media, they'll only talk about Christian nationalism when it comes up in politics like this, right? The frustrating part, though, is exactly what you're saying. Is like, how does somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene become this person? And I mean, the answer is far more commonplace, right? It's just like she learns it at church.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is what is very frustrating, right? It's like Christian nationalism does not come, or Christofascism is what I'm going with here. I'm committing to it now to make it a thing. I'm making it happen myself right now. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. It comes out of networks of people, and it comes out of networks of rhetoric, and it comes out of like the real actions of people on Sunday mornings saying the most wild shit at the pulpit, right? It's just like it's not a thing that just appears out of nowhere. It's not a purely political phenomenon. It's the translation of one type of phrase, Christianity, and it's transposing it into another sphere of discourse, which is politics. So it's just like, I don't know. People don't care until it's in the news or whatever, until a politician does it. But the networks of right-wing Christian nationalism have been active for a very long time, and they've been creating people like this for a very long time. And only now are we seeing them kind of emboldened to say these things out loud, which is, I guess, a bummer.
Yeah, I guess that's the big issue, right? Figuring out where it's happening. I'm sure there is a liberal Christian way of kind of recognizing that churches are the recruitment grounds for Christofascism, and that's what they're trying to deal with. But yeah, trying to figure out too how those churches are, again, in that Foucauldian way, like wrapped up in a big discourse of power that's been going on for a very long time, and how that funds our whole kind of U.S.-led hegemony around the world. I guess that's the harder question that maybe liberal religion journalists have just like don't have the tools in that vocabulary to do to do justice to, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, all right, folks, you heard it here. We're not doing Christian nationalism anymore. Christian nationalism is canceled. We're doing Christofascism. That's what these folks are. Start calling them that and see what happens. And I guess it'll be a great time.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can follow us on Twitter. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you do, you can join a cool reading group about degrowth that's going on right now on our Discord. So if you're on our Patreon at $2 or more, you can be in the Discord and chat with us and other folks about degrowth. It's been a really fun conversation so far. Our music is by Amoria Armstrong. Our outro is by the Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have